Welcome back to Steve's World of Wonders.
In my earlier video from day 2 of my trip to Newfoundland, specifically St. John's, Newfoundland, I visited this park, Geo Vista Park, and some of the exhibits at the Johnson Geo Center, which is in the park. I ended that video with me having lunch at the Signal Hill Visitor Center in the Newfoundland Chocolate Cafe. In this video, we will look through the exhibits at the Visitor Center, which highlight how Signal Hill and Cabot Tower illustrated the evolution of communications in Canada, from the earliest systems using flags to wireless transmission of the human voice. I then go for a hike up to Cabot Tower, named after John Cabot, used as a signaling tower and famously the location of the first transatlantic wireless transmission. After touring the tower, I take in 2 more exhibits at the Geo Center, including an exhibit about the sinking of the Titanic, which occurred about 300 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. I conclude the day heading back to summer accommodations of Memorial University. This view of the St. John's Harbor was along one of the pathways in Geo Vista Park. And also along that same pathway were a bunch of signs, one of which was about John Cabot. Explorer John Cabot, also known as Giovanni Caboto, was a European explorer on the ship Matthew. You can see a picture of the replica of that ship that they sailed for the 500th anniversary from Bristol, England, which is where John Cabot lived. And they sailed it from Bristol, England to St. John's in 1997. His voyage was in 1497. He claimed land in Canada, mistaking it for Asia. This was for Henry VII, King of England. This allowed England to make claim for much of North America. Cabot Tower, which we'll see later in this video, was built as a monument to his voyage. Along the same path was this sign, which you can see part of here. This sign is all about the anti-submarine nets that were put in the harbor to prevent submarines from getting into the harbor in World War II. The Strait Channel from the Atlantic was also the source of possible serious problems for those in the harbor attending their pursuit of fishery. The danger was almost always present for surprise attack by hostile naval vessels or pirate ships to enter the harbor with all guns blazing. This is a picture of the anti-submarine net. Each ring was 17 inches in diameter, so it had to be pretty big to stretch across the harbor to keep the submarines out. Submarines were of a great concern in sinking hundreds of merchant ships in convoys trying to cross the Atlantic. This is in World War II. The biggest danger for St. John's would have been bombardment by German battleship Bismarck or other German surface vessels. So in World War II, nets were designed to span the Narrows and were to be raised to the surface at sunset and lowered at sunrise to allow ships to pass over. 3 sets of nets anchored in the Narrows provided a further baffle to entry by hostile vessels or torpedoes. All kinds of ships needed entry into the port, including some torpedoed but afloat with badly injured crew to be rushed to our hospitals. Management of the nets was a constant, complicated chore. The danger that a ship might capsize or sink in the Narrows was always a possibility, with up to 30 naval or merchant ships to organize every day for entry, fueling, sometimes repair, berthing and departure, and dealing in many different languages was very difficult. There's a picture of the submarine nets across the narrows that lead into the harbor area. Take a walk through time. Follow the timeline and walk through Signal Hill's vibrant military and communications history. Meet the people and witness the events that formed its unique story. Fighting for fish. This is how it started. European fishermen began to harvest Newfoundland's rich fishing grounds in the early 1500s. By 1600, France and England dominated the fishery. In 1662, France established a fortified colony at Placentia, while England relied upon its navy to protect its fishing interests. The small English population of St. John's was left to fend for itself. In 1696, French soldiers and Abenaki warriors marched overland and destroyed the town. Here's some did you know facts. Fort Amherst Lighthouse was the first lighthouse in Newfoundland to use the multi-prismed Fresnel lens. I didn't know that. Some old nails and spikes from the Queen's Barracks, Queen's Battery Barracks. That's nearby here in St. John's. Signaling the world. Forefront of the development of modern communications. Marconi received the first transatlantic wireless signal at Signal Hill. Later, 3 undersea telegraph cables were landed in Cuckold's Cove in 1920. Cabot Tower was the site of one of the earliest wireless telephone calls across the Atlantic. Here's a replica of the device that sent the first signal across the Atlantic. Machine gun cartridge and clips used by the U.S. military on Signal Hill during the Second World War. An Atlantic bastion. During the First and Second World Wars, the harbor was a busy place. Signal Hill's defensive role was revived during the First World War. The Newfoundland Legion of Frontiersmen manned Fort Waldegrave, while a log boom was placed across the Narrows. During the Second World War, Newfoundland's proximity to Europe made St. John's a place of strategic importance for convoy, escort, and repair. American and Canadian forces occupied Signal Hill and the south side, and anti-torpedo baffles were placed in the Narrows. Signalmen. After the withdrawal of the British garrison in 1870, the colony of Newfoundland assumed responsibility for the signal service. The following served as chief and/or assistant signalmen from 1871 to 1958. So these are the names of some of the signalmen that served. These are binoculars and case used by Mr. Bob Gardner, who was a signalman from 1923 to 1946. Mr. Gardner had a heart attack and died while on duty at Cabot Tower in 1946. English defenses. They needed forts and soldiers to defend the town. After the French attack, England established a garrison and fortification in St. John's. The French successfully raided the town in 1705 and 1709 and occupied it in the summer of 1762. After the British recaptured St. John's in September 1762, they added new defenses. In the 1790s, they developed Signal Hill as a citadel and maintained positions here and in the Narrows until 1870. Port signaling. Hoisting flags in a bear of a wind. Hoisting flags in a bear of a wind. Signal Hill had its present name by 1762 when it served as a signaling post. Subsequently, cannons on the hill marked the time of day and warned of the outbreak of fire. Signal flags were used to alert military and commercial interests of the approach of ships. Although the military function declined after 1815, the flag signaling service continued during the two world wars and ended in 1958. So Signal Hill was called Signal Hill long before Marconi sent his signal over the Atlantic, or received the signal over the Atlantic. All the different signal flags that they'd hoist. Used in Cabot Tower. Here's a child's mug from Queen's Battery. Ginger beer bottle from the early 1800s. What's it say on here? Henry. Some old pipes. Fragments. Smoking was a popular pastime for soldiers on Signal Hill. There's some marbles. Trading with the world. For nearly 5 centuries, the harbor has been a focus of economic activity in St. John's. Much of this activity revolved around the fishery, for which St. John's was a major center. Numerous wharves, warehouses, and fish stores dotted both sides of the harbor. Here's what I was talking about before. The first transatlantic signal. The signal received by Marconi, 3 dots with the letter S. That was the first signal across the Atlantic. Okay, so this is basically the path that I traveled to get to the tower from the visitor center here. The path started at the edge of the parking lot here, and then I traveled up the dirt and gravel path and grass path up to the road and sidewalk, which I followed. I didn't take the full path. I went up the sidewalk part and up to the Cabot Tower parking lot, walked along the edge of the parking lot up to the tower. St. John Citadel. Between the 1790s and 1870s, Signal Hill was fortified and garrisoned by the British Army. The dominant fortification for the city, it also formed part of the harbor defenses. The security provided by these defenses helped St. John's to develop as a capital city. I'm inside the tower now. There's a neat commemorative sign here. This tower is erected to serve as a perpetual memorial of the 60th year of the glorious reign of Victoria. This tower is erected to serve as a perpetual memorial of the 60th year of the glorious reign of Victoria, Queen and Empress, and in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Newfoundland by John Cabot. Foundation stone laid June 22nd, 1897. Building declared open June 20th, 1900. Here's a display of what Marconi heard, what was received in Newfoundland from overseas. and you just lift the receiver here and listen to the message he got. I don't hear anything so far. Electromagnetic radio waves travel in a straight line, but the Earth is a sphere with a curved surface. According to scientific understanding in 1901, a signal transmitted from pole to would follow a straight line, and by the time it passed St. John's, Newfoundland, it would be in outer space. So, according to understanding at that time, that transmission that Marconi performed a reception of was impossible. Although it was not known in 1901, there is a region of the Earth's atmosphere that is electrically charged by the sun's rays. This region, known as the ionosphere, surrounds the Earth from an altitude of 50 kilometers up to 400 kilometers. As electromagnetic waves pass through this region, some of them are bent or refracted back towards the Earth. This refracted signal is what Marconi received on Signal Hill, so that's how it worked. The ionosphere was theorized by Arthur Keneally and Oliver Heaviside in 1902 to explain what Marconi had achieved. But definitive evidence of its existence was not demonstrated until 1924 by Edward Victor Appleton and Miles Barnett. So, Marconi was ahead of his time. I knew then that I had been absolutely right in my calculations. The electric waves which were being sent out from Poldhu had traversed the Atlantic, serenely ignoring the curvature of the Earth which so many doubters considered would be a fatal obstacle, and they were now affecting my receiver in Newfoundland, Marconi.
The wireless wizard, Marconi spans the ocean. Electric message from England.
The message was sent from England right to this tower that I'm standing in 1901. Pretty impressive. What the station looked like in the 1930s. I guess pretty much where I'm standing. Until 1949, all wireless operators at coastal stations in Newfoundland and Labrador were employees of the Canadian Marconi Company. On April 1st, 1949, the day Newfoundland became Canada's 10th province, these wireless operators became employees of the Canadian government's Department of Transportation. The next year, all the Marconi stations were acquired by the Canadian Overseas Telecommunication System. And the wireless operations were here till 1949. Here's some old transmitting equipment. Here's one called the Doug. There's a door here rattling from the wind, from the high winds outside the tower. You can see the ropes here blowing in the wind as well. I'm at the top of I'm in the turret of the tower now. There's the ocean. Across there, the signal was the signal that came to Newfoundland back in 1901. There, I hit my elbow. There's a beautiful parking lot. Got this narrow stairway that I have to walk down. There's my foot. There's a rattling ghost door with wind blowing through it.